I'm going to talk about strategic approaches. Sarah's mentioned some of the risks that climate change impacts can have in Vietnam and in other countries in the region and across the world. And Michael's just spoken about flooding, and we saw examples of areas which were exposed and pressures from development onto areas which are part of the floodplain and at some time in the future might be impacted by climate change. So I want to have a look at things from the business's perspective and give a bit of an overview of what the situation is at the moment and how we might need to improve and change it so that we have the best outcome for everybody. Can I have the next? Who's the? Terrific, I'll just wave at you. Thanks. Perfect. So I wanted to start with a question. The events are clear. We can all think of examples in our countries where there are climate change impacts. It's flooding and bushfires and things in Australia. It's flooding and sea level rise and coastal erosion here in Vietnam. Corporations are paying huge amounts of money, if you remember Sarah's slide. So why aren't corporations doing more to adapt? Why isn't this something that's on their agenda? Because it's clearly something which is costing a lot of people a lot of money, and it's not a problem which is going to go away. In fact, it's probably going to get a lot worse. Oh, I'm standing in front, sorry. So, without making excuses for corporations, I want to say some of the factors which mean that adaptation has been slow to get underway, even though it's so important. First of all, climate change really got off with a big bang in terms of mitigation. And mitigation was much more easy. It seemed important at the time to make sure that we reduce emissions as much as possible. And it's very, very easy to quantify emissions and make a direct correlation between your reduction and the improvements that you're making. Also, it makes you more energy efficient and saves you money. So despite the very difficult political environment globally with carbon emissions and responsibility, there is a straightforward market approach to it, which makes it easier. Also, in climate change impacts, we tend to think in terms of disaster risk management. And we have a lot of legislation in place which is about dealing with disasters and impacts after they happen, rallying resources, rebuilding, delegating responsibility, etc., after an event. Another big problem, and perhaps the biggest problem, is uncertainty. People want to know, if I'm building on a floodplain, what exactly are the risks? People want to quantify. They want a specific quantifiable value that they can then respond to with the risks, because that's how risk management works across the world, across different disciplines and organisations in engineering and everything. You quantify in insurance or civil engineering a number, and then you have a standard response to that number. That doesn't work with climate change because we can't use past information to inform us about what will happen in the future. So the metrics don't work in the same way. Another part of the problem is nobody knows who's responsible. Is it the people who are emitting? Is it the council that's in charge of the area where the impact will be? So they're the difficult curly questions which are meaning that reacting to adaptation is slow. So I mentioned the impacts. That starts off our approach to adaptation in terms of how we manage risk. And as I've explained, managing risk in the traditional fashion doesn't work because the planning scenarios that we use change. We're constantly getting more information about climate modelling. Our climate modelling is becoming more accurate, and also our emission scenarios are worse than we expected they would be, and the resulting climate weather patterns are worse than the original scenarios from 1992. So the old risk management doesn't work. What we need to do is think about risk as part of our strategy in an organisation. So instead of having a risk transference, I'll just insure myself, or risk avoidance, we'll stop doing that, which are the traditional ways of managing risk. We need to manage risk differently and think we need to have business continuity despite the risks, and we need to be able to cope with the risk and keep going. And what I'm saying, the only way to do that is to bring risk into the top level of your business strategy. So you don't have a siloed strategy with a financial program, human resources program, an engineering program, and what are the risks you have on the horizon. At the highest level in an organisation, at the boardroom, you need to have a risk management strategy for how you're going to cope when you are impacted, will be impacted by climate change disasters. So, that's some of the theory. What does this strategic adaptation look like? What are corporations, and in some cases governments, what are they actually doing when they're adapting well? I don't just want to talk about how awful the problem is. So, one of the things, as I just mentioned, is you eschew the standard risk response. You minimise your exposure and you increase resilience. You have to look at things on a long-term cycle. And when you're looking at everything in a long-term cycle, it becomes easy to manage risk. Use all the available information. Realise that preemptive action, so taking something before something happens, sets you up better for an event in the future. And that there are opportunities and cost savings for responding earlier. Very quickly, in my last 10 seconds, I wanted to sort of explain how climate adaptation works with CSR, corporate social responsibility, and how even though the two come from very different places, they can learn from each other as a methodology. So, CSR is about compliance and reputational risk, climate's about impact risks and impact strategy, and what they share, because I have to finish up, is, here we go, mainstream is the crucial thing. By mainstreaming, what I mean is incorporating a risk approach to adaptation into your fundamental business strategy. For development, it means integrating climate change adaptation into your development projects and your development spending. Having resilience as an outcome rather than a false state of avoidance. There's a call for corporations to have a leadership role in leading government to make legislation to ban them from developing on floodplains, because ultimately that's in the corporations and the governments and the citizens' best interests, that there are proven long-term financial gains, and go beyond compliance. So don't take false hope from saying I've complied, therefore I'm safe. You need to go beyond compliance. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jules. I'll now turn over to Donovan.
I might just stand up here, why not? That's me. It is. Excuse me. I won't be long. Thank you.